Thank you everyone for joining us today. In this session, we'll be discussing the basics of dust collection design for the pharmaceutical industry. My name is John Daniel. I lead up our corporate efforts to support engineering firms here at Donaldson Company. We also have Amy Miller on with us today. She's our training manager. She'll be working behind the scenes and will be moderating the Q&A session at the end.
Hello, thanks to everyone for joining us today. I just wanted to let you know, submit questions into the chat box as you think of them throughout the webinar, and Anil would love to answer them towards the end of the session today.
Yeah, thank you, Amy. We're going to start off today's webinar by reviewing some of the common pharmaceutical processes that typically utilize dust collection. We'll get into the four primary components of pharmaceutical dust collection system design, including hoods, ducts, collectors, and fans. We'll finish up with everyone's favorite part at the end, the Q&A session. Please note it can take years of experience to become a dust collection expert, and the goal of the session is just to give you an overview of the basics. In case you're not familiar with Donaldson Company, we've been solving customers' complex filtration challenges for over 100 years. We were founded in 1915 by Frank Donaldson Jr., who invented the world's first tractor engine filter. Today, we're one of the largest providers of unique filtration technologies. We excel at producing high-quality filters and equipment. We pride ourselves in having a global reach with a local touch. Our world headquarters is in Bloomington, Minnesota, and we have 55 manufacturing plants and 21 distribution centers around the world. Before I introduce our featured speaker, I wanted to quickly explain how to engage with us. As Amy indicated, as you think of questions throughout the webinar, please put them into the chat box. Neil will answer them towards the end of our session. And then during the session, if you have any questions that you need to answer that Neil asked, you can do a thumbs up, thumbs down during the session. And that'll be at the bottom of the screen with the face icon. So I'm pleased to introduce our featured speaker today, Neil Young. Neil's a territory manager with Donaldson out of Kansas City. His territory includes Nebraska, Kansas, Western Iowa, Western Missouri. He has over 13 years of experience in the air quality control industry. Prior to joining Donaldson, he spent 10 years with a large industrial air filtration supplier working across all industries. Neil holds a bachelor's degree from Northwest Missouri State and also is a Lean Six Sigma Green Belt certified. I'm handing it over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about one of my favorite industries, the pharmaceutical industry. We'd like to start out by asking about your experience with designing dust collection systems specific to pharmaceutical manufacturing. So if you could please use the chat box and type in a letter that best aligns with your level of experience, that'd be great.
All right, looks like we're getting a range of experience levels here from 1 and A and B, C. Okay, we're good. Looks like we have a full spectrum of experience here on the line with us, Neil.
Awesome. Thank you guys for sharing that. It's helpful for us to understand where everyone's at. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the dust that's generated during pharmaceutical applications. Why is dust control important? Well, there's multiple reasons why it's important to control the dust, such as improving air quality. It's harder and harder to find workers today that want to come to work and work in these manufacturing environments. So it's really important to have good air quality and give them a good space to work. Exposure control is another one. We want to reduce the potential dust in their breathing zones for those who are operating these processes. You've got environmental concerns. EPA standards for outdoor exhausted environmental air quality and outlet emission requirements have to be met, as well as safety concerns and hazards. NFPA is something you'll hear more about later on. NFPA has guidelines for fire and explosion mitigation. Pharmaceutical manufacturing follows current good manufacturing processes, or CGMP, as well as standards that are required by the FDA and other governing bodies. And then lastly, just cleanliness. A clean facility has less issues, less maintenance requirements, higher equipment reliability, and overall increased production. And then most importantly, it's a safe work environment. So pharmaceutical manufacturing is a diverse and evolving industry that develops and manufactures consumable products for health and nutritional purposes. Typically, products fall into one of two categories. You have finished goods and specialty chemicals. Finished goods, we're specifically talking about prescription medications, over-the-counter medications, vitamins, nutritional supplements, cosmetics, and personal care items. When we reference specialty chemicals, those consist of either excipients, which is just a fancy way of saying an inactive ingredient like a flavor, colors, binders, or we're talking about biological compounds known as active pharmaceutical ingredients or APIs. So within the pharmaceutical manufacturing, there are multiple processes in which manufacturers need to control the dust. Typically starts with the receipt of materials, where non-medication ingredients generally arrive in some form of a bulk bag. They then go through a crushing and milling process before being weighed and mixed in an industrial mixer. And then finally, they go through the granulation process, where often the product undergoes a high pressure compaction prior to being dried. And throughout each of these processes, it's important to capture any dust that is generated. The other main area where dust is generated is during product formulation. After the granules are formed, powders are weighed and packaged. Pills, on the other hand, go through a tableting, coating, which makes them easier to swallow, and then they go through a packaging process. Manufacturers also may produce capsules. Sometimes those are filled with liquid. In that case, we don't require dust collection, but they're also commonly filled with a dry formula, which can be an area where dust is generated. So let's talk about common properties of pharmaceutical dust, right? It's typically small and uniform in size. It's lightweight, hygroscopic, meaning it attracts moisture. So any wet applications or any introduction of moisture to a process can cause that particulate to become extremely sticky, and then it has a tendency to dry and become a hard crust and blind off filtration. So that can be a challenge. Oftentimes, pharmaceutical dust can be agglomerative, meaning it sticks together either as a nuisance dust or part of a process. Dust that's introduced to moisture or solvents will oftentimes attract or bind to each other, creating large clumps that can also create filtration issues unless they're planned for otherwise. Prolonged exposure to many varieties of pharmaceutical dust can be hazardous to workers and environmental health. You know, a lot of these medications that are being made have those APIs, and it's important to make sure that we mitigate any risk for the workers. And lastly, it's often combustible. So we'll touch briefly on combustible dust. You know, pharmaceutical dust, as I mentioned, is commonly combustible, and that means that there's a risk of a fire, flash fire, or an explosion. So if we look at the fire triangle there on the left-hand side at the bottom of the screen, to create a fire, you need three things. You've got to have an oxidizer, which is your fuel, typically oxygen, combustible dust, and an ignition source. An ignition source examples in pharmaceutical manufacturing, typically it's going to be a machine malfunction, a spark that's created from some machine malfunction that works its way through the ductwork into the dust collector. And so if a fine particle is combustible and then it mixes with air, like the airflow coming into a dust collector, which is usually oxygen, and then it meets the ignition source, it can result in a fire. If we move left to right and we look at that center graphic, you'll notice that if we add in the dispersion of dust, which typically occurs with a lot of these dust collectors or pulse jets, we're pulsing those filters with air, dispersing the dust, then you get the potential for a flash fire. And that's a fire that spreads by means of a flame front, rapidly burning through some form of fuel or your combustible dust without the production of a damaging pressure. And then the last graphic there at the bottom is the explosion pentagon. So we added confinement of that dust. Most of these dust collectors are confined space. So you've got all of the ingredients necessary there for an explosion. As I said, it's a complex issue. We have separate trainings specifically dedicated to combustible dust and mitigation practices. I'll circle back at the end a little bit on some of the options that are available, but for now, just know if that dust is combustible, you need to have a mitigation plan in place to protect the workers and the property. So let's dive into the basics of dust collection system specific to pharmaceutical manufacturing. Here you've got a diagram of how a typical source collection dust control system works. And you've got your fan or your blower, and it generates an airflow which is used to capture dirty air beginning at the hood, convey that dirty air through a series of ducts to a dust collector. And here the contaminant is separated out. Clean air passes through the filter media to the fan where it's discharged to atmosphere. Just note, a lot of times in pharmaceutical applications, we're not allowed to vent outdoors, so it's common to have that return air go through a HEPA rated filter and be brought back into the building. And the important thing to note in these systems, each component is selected in size based on the characteristics of the dust or the fume and the resulting required airflow. So if one component is poorly designed, it can impact the entire system. There are two main objectives of a dust collection system design, and those are to accurately predict the air volume required to effectively capture and control the contaminants at the point of generation, and the total energy required to produce those airflows. The image you see here on your screen is the industrial ventilation manual. It's what we refer to as our Bible for this topic. The vent manual is written by the American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, or the ACGIH, and that's a nonprofit scientific organization that advances occupational and environmental health. They have multiple courses throughout the year on system design. I've attended one as well as many of my peers. These guidelines are considered by most in the industry, including OSHA, to be the standard for proper design. And the goal is to end up with a system that meets the performance criteria. So there are a lot of different formulas that we use when we're designing a system, but the most basic and widely applied is the airflow. We refer to that as Q equals V times A. So in that formula, Q represents the cubic feet per minute, or CFM, of air that's needed. And in order to get the Q, we have to multiply the velocity of the air, the V, by the area, the A, of the hood or duct that the air is flowing through. This formula is the basic building block of dust collection system design. It begins at the pickup points, and we calculate the necessary airflow using this formula for each pickup, and that'll give us the total CFM needed for the system. This formula is also used when calculating the needed duct, the velocity within the ductwork. So if we have, two of these parameters, we can always solve for the third. And throughout the design of a system, we'll refer to this Q equals V times A over and over again. Some basic terminology that I want to review for those of you who may be new to dust collection. Velocity is a measure of linear speed for an object. We'll talk about a few different types of velocities in this presentation, such as duct velocity or conveying velocity. That's the speed of the air flowing through the duct, and capture velocity, which is the speed of the air at the hood. Another type of velocity you'll hear us reference is air to media ratio, or AMR. And this is the velocity of the airstream as it enters and passes through the filter media. Sometimes you'll hear it referred to as filtration velocity. Essentially, we're calculating it by taking the actual CFM, or the airflow, divided by the total filter area, and it's expressed in a ratio form such as 6:1. So that would be 6 cubic feet of airflow for every 1 square foot of filter media. And the last basic term I wanted to talk about is static pressure. This is the resistance to airflow in the system from things like the collector, the filters in the collector, which change over time as they become dirty, the hoods, the ductwork, turns. So static pressure is a critical design factor when you're choosing the fan and designing a system. So the first component that we're going to take a look at is the hood. This is where it all starts. It's the critical component of a system design that allows for containment and collection of that fugitive dust. A well-designed hood should be able to pull the particulate away from the operator's breathing zone. So I like this image here where you have, you know, the well-designed hood. You see the arrows are pulling the air away from the operator's space, but it also shows kind of an alternate side where maybe it wouldn't be as good. If he were working on this station behind him where the air is being pulled directly in front of him, that particulate and that potentially harmful dust could be pulled right in front of his face. So it's a good example of what a good system design would look like. So a well-designed hood, again, it's going to minimize the amount of airflow that's required to effectively capture and control that contaminant where it's released. You want just enough energy to pick up that dust and pull it into the hood and into the ductwork. And you want to do this, again, while minimizing the amount of energy required. So when it comes to assessing an existing system, some of the common mistakes that I often see in the field are the wrong style of hoods being used. It's not located in an effective position, or you've got inadequate airflow at the hood. If you don't have enough airflow, you've got dust laying around and additional housekeeping requirements. If you have too much, you can be pulling material that you don't want to be pulling. You know, often in pharmaceutical, the dust is their product, right? So they want to capture the nuisance dust, but they don't want to be pulling product and revenue into a nuisance dust collector. And lastly, if you're pulling too much, you know, the higher the energy consumption required, it's inefficient from a cost standpoint. So let's look at a couple different styles of hoods. The most common style is a closed capture hood, which relies on establishing a general airflow pattern into the hood opening to create a capture velocity at a specific distance from the hood. And there are 5 main types of hood. Each of these work. Some work a little better than others depending on the application, and they all have a different resistance calculation. So we have a raw edge hood, which is really the worst. It's got the highest resistance because it's just drawing air from everywhere. So typically you have to have a bigger fan, you have to have bigger ductwork. All of this adds to not only the upfront cost, but the operational cost of the system. Next, you have a flanged hood, which does a little bit better job of directing where you're pulling that airflow from. Oftentimes you'll see a tapered hood if you need a specific area. And then probably the best design hood would be a bell-mouthed hood. And then lastly, we have the slotted hood. This is commonly seen where you're working at a bench station, maybe a weighing and mixing type application that's pulling it, again, away from the operator's face towards the ductwork. So regardless of which style of hood, in order for it to be effective, it's got to be located properly relative to the point where the particulate is generated. So like we said earlier, the first objective in hood design is to minimize the air volume required to maintain capture efficiency. How efficiently can we pick up that particle of dust and get it into the ductwork? To minimize the air volume, the hood must be close to the capture point without disrupting the process. If a hood is positioned, you know, twice the distance from a contaminant emission point rather than at the capture point, it would need to draw approximately 4 times more air to produce the same capture efficiency. Again, you'll hear this over and over. More air means larger collection equipment, larger ducts, a larger fan with higher horsepower. All of this adds to capital and operational costs. So when determining the required airflow at the hood, the main design factor is called the capture velocity. And this is the velocity that's required at the point where the dust is generated in order to gain control of that dust and direct it into the hood. For pharmaceutical manufacturing, capture velocity is typically somewhere around 50 to 250 feet per minute, although it depends on the application and the style of the hood and the nature of the dust particles. When designing hoods, we want to avoid airflow extremes. Too much airflow at the hood or pickup point may mean you're picking up good product rather than just nuisance dust. And since more energy is required to move that airflow, can lead to higher than expected operational costs. Insufficient airflow at the hood could require additional housekeeping measures to be implemented. And depending on the type of dust, may lead to an increased risk of exposure to potentially harmful dusts.
Neil, I'll interrupt you here for a moment if you need to grab a drink of water.
Yeah.
Just a quick reminder to everyone to make sure you chat any questions into the chat box, and we'll address them at the end of the session.
Thanks, John. So once we've designed the proper hood to pick up the dust and move it into the ductwork, the goal is to move that dust through the filtration system in a series of ducts. So as you can see here, we've got the hoods, and then following the hoods, you've got the duct design. A properly designed duct system should pull the minimum airflow required at each hood, maintain these velocities required to transport that material through the duct and to the collector. And you must be able to do this utilizing the least amount of energy as possible and minimizing any wear and tear on the duct components. So the analogy I think of on this is, if you're having to drink from a coffee stirrer instead of a regular straw, right? It takes a lot more energy to get that drink where you want it to be. It's the same philosophy with ductwork. You want to be able to pull everything through the ductwork with as little energy as possible. Some common mistakes that we see when it comes to duct design: the wrong type of ductwork is being used, incorrect duct size, or the fittings are wrong, and then the system's not balanced correctly. When it comes to ducts, minimum duct velocity is a critical design factor. If you go below, dust could settle out within the ducts, and that can create safety issues. For pharmaceutical manufacturing, minimum conveying velocities are going to be in the 3,000 to 4,500 feet per minute range. It is important to note, however, 4,000 feet per minute is the minimum duct velocity if the dust is combustible. That's why we typically see duct velocities in the 4,000 to 4,500 feet per minute range. If the duct velocity is too high, again, more energy is required to move that air through the duct. Ultimately, it can impact the size of the system, fan, as well as create issues such as increased noise, abrasion, or wear and tear. All right, we're going to break things up a little bit. I'm going to show you a few different images, and I'd like you to give me a thumbs up if you think this is a good idea to use in pharmaceutical manufacturing collection, or a thumbs down if you think it's a bad idea. If you're not sure, take a guess. Okay, here's the first one. Rectangular duct on the dirty air side. Give us a thumbs up if you think this is a good idea, or a thumbs down if you think it's a bad idea for dust collection systems.
All right. Looks like mostly thumbs down on this one. Yep, thumbs down. Neil?
Yeah, rectangular duct is commonly used in HVAC applications where you're just moving air, right? There's not really any particulate or any dust in the air, it's just air. So rectangular duct does not have a place in industrial systems. When you're using rectangular ducting, the velocity at the edges and the corners becomes so low that you're almost guaranteed to have material settle out. Not only does this require more energy to pull through, but the additional weight of that dust can exceed the duct support system and leave you with a big mess to clean up. So you only want to use round duct on the dirty air side. Now, if you're returning air back to the building and it's gone through the filters and it's gone through a HEPA, it's okay to use rectangular on the clean air side. All right, next up we have class 3 ductwork. Is this good or bad for dust collection systems?
Thumbs, kind of a mix of thumbs up, thumbs down. It's Getting both answers back.
All right. Let's give everybody a second to chime in there. So when specifying industrial duct systems, it's important to make sure and call out heavy duty industrial ductwork, not HVAC duct that you'd find in your house. Most dust collection applications are going to use class 2, 3, and 4 ductwork designed to SMACNA standards. Typically, the higher the class rating of the ductwork, the heavier gauge. So thumbs up on class 3 round ductwork. All right, next up, spiral duct, good or bad for dust collection systems?
Looks like our audience is saying mostly thumbs down on this.
This is a touchy subject depending on who you talk to. So spiral duct is less expensive and it can be used effectively, but the concern that we have with spiral duct is it can leak air and impact your design airflow by as much as 10%. So if you do specify spiral duct, make sure you're using a heavy gauge, typically 16 gauge for pharmaceutical dust, and make sure it's smooth on the inside. We don't like to see spiral duct on the outside. It's just a prime source for water to enter the ductwork and get into the dust collection system. So use spiral duct with caution. If it's outdoors, typically I prefer to use something other than spiral duct. Okay, how about flexible ductwork? Good or bad?
Pretty consistent. Thumbs down across the, well, one thumbs up, but mostly thumbs down on this one, Neil.
Well, it's really popular because it gives the operator the ability to modify the hood location to fit their process. But it does come at a price. You know, there's not a smooth inner surface on flexible ductwork. So as that air moves through the duct, it faces resistance the entire way and therefore requires significantly more energy than traditional hard ducting. So sometimes it's unavoidable. For connection purposes, you need to use flexible ductwork. If you have to use it, we recommend minimizing it as much as possible. One of the most frustrating things you see when you're walking through a plant is when somebody's got maybe 4 feet more flexible ductwork than they need hooked up to a connection. And what you have is then you end up with a bunch of elbows that are in there that don't need to be there, creating even more static pressure. So minimize it when you have to use it. All right, last one, branch entries with T's and hard 90-degree turns, good or bad for dust collection?
Looks like this one, all thumbs down.
Smart group. So if your elbows are mitered at 90-degree turns, all that air, you think of air as, you've probably heard this 100 times, it's going to follow the path of least resistance. So it doesn't have the ability to slow down and then speed back up. Instead, it slams into the back wall of that miter, creating turbulence, and the air coming into it faces more resistance. Turbulence equals more energy consumption or higher static pressure. So again, more expensive fan, larger ductwork, higher operating costs. So when designing a system, it's important to select options that minimize the amount of turbulence within the duct. Avoid things like T's and mitered 90s. I always use the highway or the freeway example on this. You know, we don't have 90-degree turns entering and exiting freeways. If we did, you can only imagine the amount of wrecks we'd have. Kind of the same concept with duct design. So we'll touch on balanced design. Having a balanced system is one of the most important aspects to effective dust collection. It ensures that you're pulling the right amount of air from each hood. And in order to do this, the energy needs for each leg of a system at a junction should be the same. And it's really common, we see it quite often, where customers will add drops to an existing system without even considering the impact it has on the existing equipment that they're venting. So in most cases, these systems are aren't modified to accommodate the additional airflow or static, and then it becomes out of balance. Luckily, if you know a customer has a potential to be expanding their process, there are ways to design future lines into a system so they don't have to sacrifice performance when they expand. But if a customer needs to add a line to an existing system, give us a call, call in a professional for help. Don't just add the drop and expect the system to work the way it did before. Okay, the next system component is the dust collector. The main objective of a dust collector is to deliver the required efficiency while operating in a predictable, stable, and economic fashion. The most common mistakes or things that could go wrong when it comes to the collector design are using the wrong filtration technology, incorrect sizing of a collector, either too aggressive or too conservative, poor material handling, so insufficient dust removal at the hopper level can create issues with bridging, rat holing, depending on the dust, and then poor installation. So the inlet orientation and outlet fan locations, if those aren't designed properly, can create airflow and distribution problems within the collector. When we look at pharmaceutical applications, most of the time you're going to be dealing with cartridge collectors. If you're dealing with a particularly sticky or moist dust, that's where you may want to bring in a specific type of baghouse that uses wider envelope shaped filters. That's the best option for that sticky, hard to clean dust. So if we start with the cartridge collectors, because they're the most commonly used, the reason they're the most commonly used is they're typically smaller. They've got a lower initial cost than a baghouse, and they work really well for low to medium dust loads on a dust that's fine, uniform, and dry. And that's commonly what you see in pharmaceutical manufacturing. They're designed to be continuous duty, so you don't have to shut them down when it's time to pulse or clean the filters. They clean with plant compressed air, and they use smaller, easy to handle cartridges, which change out much quicker than a traditional bag and cage. So kind of a fun little history lesson on cartridge collectors. Back in the 70s, when we brought the cartridge collector to the market, we basically looked at a baghouse design and thought, okay, we'll put a pleated filter in here, a cartridge, increase the amount of filtration area in that unit, and keep a smaller footprint. And it worked okay, but it wasn't great. So the next iteration was taking a look at where the inlet came in, because the problem with the previous generation was you had can velocity issues where a lot of times you'd have wear holes that would form on the back side of these filters, and the dust couldn't get pulsed down because as it would pulse, the incoming gas stream was putting it right back on the filter. So we moved the inlet upward to allow gravity to assist us in bringing the dust into the collector. And again, it was a step forward, but we still found opportunities for improvement. So in the 80s, we made a huge step forward when we took the filters from being hung vertically and hung them horizontally. And what this did was allowed gravity to help even more. And when we took a look at combined it with our state-of-the-art airflow testing, we could see a dramatic increase in the ability of the collector to remove dust. 10 years ago, we took another look at it and thought, how can we improve this even more? And that's when we introduced our DFE collector. And you'll notice on the DFE, the inlet's been moved over a venturi so that that section where the inlet is over the top of our stainless or galvanized steel venturis. So the heavy dust will fall out without ever even touching a filter. The fines will make their way onto the filters. And again, you've got gravity doing a lot of the work to get it out of the collector. So just touch on a couple installs that we've done in pharmaceutical. This is an example of a DFE. Obviously, this is an outdoor collector. It's got a silencer on the fan as well as some vibration blankets on the fan to help keep the sound levels low. As you can see, they're returning the air back to the building there from the silencer. Also have an airlock there at the discharge. And here's another one that we did. I like this picture because it shows some mitigation practices for combustible dust. This is obviously a combustible dust application. Those big hood scoops that you see on top of the DFE are flameless vents. Those allow, if there were some sort of deflagration to occur, those vents absorb that and keep it from spreading throughout the building. And then in the top left corner, you see the little red box up there. That's an inlet isolation. So should something like that occur, it detects the pressure wave change and slams shut there so that the deflagration can't work its way back up the process into the plant. If you've got a particularly high static system, say 20 inches or more water gauge, we may look at a different type of cartridge collector like our TD collector. Just like the DFE, it's best for low and medium dust loads with fine, uniform, and dry dust, but it tends to handle those higher static pressures better because it's got a lower operating pressure drop. Here's a recent install we did of a TD cartridge collector. You can see it's got an explosion vent, that little gray panel that you see there. If the pressure exceeds a certain point, that will release, relieving the pressure and keeping it from going through the system. Just a nice install there. So cartridge collectors like the DFE and the TD, obviously they use cartridge filters, and these come in many different shapes and sizes and different media types depending on what the application and the customer's needs are. Typically when using cartridge collectors, I recommend a fine fiber media because it significantly outperforms cellulose-based medias, and it will result in less frequent filter changes for your customer. Fine fiber media was originally introduced by Donaldson back in the 80s. So if you look at these images, the red dots are representative of a single dust particle. And as you can see on the cellulose media on the left, it's got a lot larger voids and more areas where that particulate can get into the depth of the filtration media itself. Both large and small particles can embed deeper into the media, and this is called depth loading. It's not necessarily a good situation. It increases the differential pressure of that filter pretty significantly. However, if you look at the fine filter media, fine fiber media, you can see that the dust doesn't easily get beyond the surface. So this allows for surface loading of the filter. That improves the filtration and cleaning efficiency of the filter. Here's a little simulation, if I can get this to work, just to kind of show what that looks like. You see how those really small particles work their way into the filtration media, but the larger particles stay on the outside on the surface and aren't easily removed. On the non-fine fibers, the more of those particulate that works its way into the filter, the quicker the filter has to clean. The more it cleans, the faster it has to be replaced. The most common filter that I recommend for pharmaceutical is Donaldson's UltraWeb Spun Bond. It's got a MERV 15 rating, which filters down to a 0.3 micron size. Very commonly, when a dust collector is indoors and the exhaust is returned to the facility, we recommend a HEPA after filter, and those are typically 99.97% efficient. So earlier I mentioned that pharmaceutical dust can be hygroscopic, right? It attracts moisture, and this creates a moist, sticky dust that can be very challenging because it tends to cake on the filters and become hard to remove. In these types of situations, typically I look more to a specialty baghouse collector like the one pictured here, which is our Dalomatic G2. It uses an envelope style bag, so it almost looks like a pillowcase going in. But when that compressed air gets shot into the filter bag, it expands greatly. And then when it gets brought back online, it creates a violent pop against that cage, which does a really good job of shocking that heavy dust cake off of the filter and moving it down. You'll notice again, it's a downflow design system, so the filters are in horizontally which allows gravity to help us out once we've created that initial shock to dislodge the dust. And it works really, really well for applications where you've got a sticky, difficult to remove dust. So there are a few different types of filter media that work well with the Dolomatic in these challenging type of situations. The most common is Tetra Tech's on polyester. So that's a PTFE membrane that's bonded to 16-ounce polyester. It delivers superior dust cake release and really high filtration efficiency. That membrane that's laminated onto that base media kind of acts as the dust cake, and it's got a lot of very tiny pores, which makes it hard for that dust to create a cake. It tends to slide off. So this is an example of a Dolomatic that we did recently. Again, you can see that you've got a Fike flameless vent there. So we must have combustible dust. The fan is exhausting either outside or to a floor above. I'm not sure what it was on this application. But you also have an NFPA airlock here, and the controls conveniently located right next to the collector. When we talk about hazardous material that we really don't want to come in contact with our skin, our eyes, our breathing zone, another important design consideration is containment. So here are just a few examples of how we can help minimize worker exposure when we're dealing with potent dusts. In the first photo, you've got a HEPA after filter housing. Typically, again, this is after the airstream has gone through the dust collector, clean air discharge from the fan, and then it goes to a secondary after filter, which is typically a HEPA or greater rating. It's going to capture those fine particulates that either get through the filter media, or it's a secondary fail-safe if you develop a hole in a filter or something like that. The after filter is there to prevent it from going back into the building. Photo 2, this is just an example of a underhopper locking cage. Pharmaceutical dust has a street value, I guess, to some people. So it's a device that's used to prevent theft, essentially, for collectors that are located outdoors. Photo 3, this is an example of our bag in, bag out design for safe filter changes. So this allows the operator to change the filter without ever coming in contact with the dust. They can reach in through those plastic sleeves, pull the filter directly into the sleeves, tie it off without having to come in contact with the dust. So we've gone through the design, we've designed the hoods, we've designed the ductwork, we've got the collector. Probably the most important thing and the very last thing that I do is select and size the fan. So the fan is the heart and soul of the system. It has two responsibilities. First, it's got to deliver the necessary airflow at the required static pressure to drive the operation of the system over a range of static pressures. Secondly, the fan should be able to deliver the desired static and airflow with an appropriate energy efficiency at a sound level that's acceptable. Fan challenges generally fall into two categories: poor fan selection and poor installation. So the two main system designs for fan, again, static pressure and airflow. And this is an example of a recent system that I designed where we had a required airflow of 9,000 CFM. When we added up the static pressure loss from the hoods, it was 1.5 inches a water gallon. The ductwork was another 2.5 inches. And then we always design for 6 inches on the collector. We design based on what it would be like with dirty filters. So worst case scenario. And then the filter to the fan ducting was another 1 inch of loss. So the total system static pressure for the project was 11 inches. So 9,000 CFM at 11 inches. So to size the fan, we used the system static pressure of 11 inches and line that up with the airflow of 9,000 CFM. And when we line those up, You can see the fan curves on the chart, which tell us the effective range of each fan size. So in this case, I selected a turret backward inclined or a TBI 30. Just a note, when the filters are new, the process owner will need to damper back the fan unless they have a variable frequency drive to adjust the speed automatically. However, I wouldn't size down to a TBI 25 since it may not provide enough airflow when the filters get dirty. So if you look at the 25, it may be okay until those filters get close to that 6 inches, and then you're going to have issues with the fan not being able to pull the right amount of air. So to finish things up, and then we'll open it up for questions, there are a few other design considerations to think about. The first one is the total cost of ownership, right? How much energy is required to operate this system? Where is the unit coming from? How easy is it to get replacement parts? How long do the filters last? Is it easy to change the filters or maintain the system? And then what's the life expectancy? Another consideration to mention is, technology is being used more and more these days to monitor dust collection systems. Donaldson has developed a device called IQ that gathers important process data in real time and allows the operators to create automated alerts and historical reports and data reporting. This is something that we offer on every new system that's sold at no charge. And it's a really great way to manage and track for regulatory compliance information. And it helps us troubleshoot dust collection issues more efficiently as well. And speaking of regulatory considerations, everybody's favorite topic, each of these agencies, they may have design expectations to reduce process-related hazards. And as we all know, they don't always communicate and they aren't always consistent with each other. So knowing hazards related to the process the system is designed to handle will allow you and the customer to make some of critical design decisions up front in the process. It can be really expensive and time consuming to change design once the equipment's been installed and in operation. And then briefly, just to circle back on the topic of combustible dust, the National Fire Protection Agency, or NFPA, is a global self-funded nonprofit organization that's devoted to eliminating death, injury, property, and economic loss due to fire and related hazards. The standards that are developed by the NFPA are called consensus standards because they are widely recognized by authorities. NFPA standards are referenced in national and international fire and mechanical codes, which are adopted by many states and municipalities. So if local building inspectors and fire marshals may be required to enforce NFPA standards. Also, OSHA considers NFPA standards to be good engineering practices. And during a general safety inspection, they may reference NFPA standards when issuing fines to a facility under the general duties clause. So on this slide, you can see some different mitigation options that process owners can consider, such as the flameless vents that we showed earlier, inlet isolation. Depending on the application, the authority having jurisdiction, and the process owner's risk tolerance, you may need one or many different options in this. But if you're having issues trying to decide what's necessary, give us a call and we'll be able to provide you with the expertise needed to make the best selections for each situation. So just to recap, designing dust collection systems for pharmaceutical manufacturing can be complicated. There's a lot that goes into it, but that's why we're here. We've sold countless dust collection systems around the world, and we've got local support in your market. So we're here to help make sure you get it right the first time.
Yeah, thank you, Neil, and great job. We're going to finish up with some Q&A, as Neil mentioned. Neil and Amy, you can turn your cameras back on now. Just a heads up to everyone who attended, you will receive an email that includes your professional development hour credit. We're going to put up a link on the chat box to our webinar page where you can watch various on-demand webinars on system design. We'll get to work on putting this webinar up as soon as possible. There's also a form you can fill out if you're interested for an in-person lunch and learn or a customized lunch and learn for a project you may be working on with your team. If you have additional follow-up questions or if you don't get your your email on your hour credit, feel free to send me an email here and I'll make sure that you do get it. Amy, we'll turn it over to you for our first question.
All right. Several comments in the chat box saying you did a great job, Neil, just to let you know. Okay, you ready?
Fire away.
Excellent. So this is kind of from the beginning of the webinar. We're talking about like hoods, I think mostly what these are talking about, and general system design. So the first question is, do we need redundancy for the blower?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Like would you need a second blower, I guess, and I don't think you do, right? If you size it.
No, typically if it's sized right, the one fan is all that you need. Sometimes you'll see customers put a secondary fan just in the ductwork if they're having problems maintaining velocity, but that's typically something that's done if it wasn't designed properly the first time.
Thank you. Sorry, see, look at that. Hard one right out of the gate for you, Neil. Okay, so here's your next one. I'm just reading these as they're asked. This person's asking about the static pressure in the main duct. So the question is, what is the static pressure in the main duct? I'm thinking maybe it's probably related to how to determine what it is.
It really depends on the layout of the ductwork, right? If you just have a straight duct, you have very low static pressure. It's dependent on what the diameter of the ductwork is, so that area, what your velocities are, and how straight the run is. So for example, like a 90-degree elbow might have a 1/4 of an inch to a 1/2 inch of static loss, depending on the sizing. So it's really dependent on what your duct layout is. If you have a system and a layout and you want us to double check that for you, we do that every day. So we've got a spreadsheet where we can plug in how far the straight runs are, what the duct size is, how many elbows, what types of mitigation equipment, everything else is in, and come up with a total static pressure for you.
Thank you, Neil. All right, so the next question, this is also related to hoods. What's the best practice in terms of distance? I know we talked about making sure it's not too far away, it's not too close. Is there like a best practice as far as distance?
So the vent guide gives some recommendations depending on what the type of dust is, but it's really it comes down to a lot of our application experience, right? We've got manuals, we've got books, we've got references based on what kind of dust it is and how far away that hood should be. But the right answer is just far enough away to pick that dust particle up, move it into the hood. If you're too far and you have to do it with more fan speed, then you're adding cost to the system. If you're too close and you're pulling too much, then that can be a problem as well. So really, it's just enough to take control of that particulate and move it towards the ductwork.
Thank you. So your next question, this is in the ductwork section. They're asking about conveying velocity and why is it that 4,000 feet per minute is the minimum if the dust is combustible?
That is a great question for NFPA. The answer, the answer that I have is because NFPA says so. But I think it has to do with the likelihood of dust being able to fall out and settle out at 4,000 feet per minute is pretty low, right? It would have to be an extremely heavy dust to not be conveyed properly at 4,000 feet per minute.
Fair enough. All right, so next question. This is related to balancing the system. Or how do you validate that the system that you designed is actually successful? They're asking, other than air balancing, so other than maybe taking an airflow measurement, are there any maybe particle count tests that you perform or anything else to confirm that the system is working properly?
So we do, anytime we sell a system, we provide startup assistance. And part of that startup is not just verifying that everything was installed properly, but making sure that the system's balanced up front, right? That it's doing what it was designed to do. Outside of that, I think our IQs helped immensely in being able to validate that the system's working the way that it's supposed to. Because when the IQ system's put in and the customer's okay sharing that information with us, then we're able to go in and see, okay, the differential pressure is climbing at a gradual pace, just like it should. Cleaning system's working. Outlet emissions are not anywhere on the radar. That's usually a good indication. But like I said, a lot of it comes down to our experience over the years, knowing at the installation phase, if the system's balanced and you're getting the right airflows and the right conveying velocities, it's going to work.
Neil, sometimes I've seen people use the pitot tubes, right?
Yeah.
That's a way
Yeah.
to check it after the fact in the ductwork, right?
Yeah. So that's what we do in startup. When I say we balance the system, that's exactly what we do. We're taking airflow measurements with a pitot tube, confirming that we're in that 4,000 to 4,500 feet per minute range, whatever our design was for. And then we've also got manometers that we can use at the hood, right, to make sure that we've got the right capture velocity at the hood as well.
All right, so next question, this was in the collector section. For balancing multiple branches or pickup points, are the use of slide gates acceptable, and is there any other acceptable means to balance the system?
So slide gates are very commonly used. That's a great one. So you use slide gates. Typically, if you put an outlet damper on your fan, you've got the ability to kind of manipulate those airflows with that, as far as the velocities are concerned. And then more and more customers these days, especially on systems that are running anywhere from 10 to 24 hours a day, are going to put some form of VFD on the fan just to make sure that it's only pulling and using as much energy as it needs to. But the blast gates are, if you've got multiple drops across the system and they're not all being used at the same time, blast gates are a great way to help keep things balanced.
Thank you. Next question. I think you answered this maybe after they asked the question, but we'll just make sure the person got their question answered. How does the fine fiber media have a longer lifespan than cellulose fiber media does?
It comes down to cleaning. Like a filter, I always tell people it's good for so many cleaning cycles. When you pulse a filter, you're disrupting the fibers in that filter media, right? You're expanding it and it contracts. And the more you do that, the quicker the filter wears out. So because that surface media, the fine fiber, is a surface filtration, it doesn't have to clean as often. It breathes easier. It's got a lower differential pressure. So cellulose-based media, when those particles get caught into the media itself, they have to clean more frequently. The differential pressure goes up, which triggers the cleaning. The more it cleans, the quicker they wear out.
Would you recommend the Dolomatic for tablet coating pans?
If it's got the opportunity for moisture, yes. If it's a drier coating and they're kind of doing a more of a thermal process to adhere it, then it may not be required. But if it's any potential for moisture, if it's a spray coating or something like that, then yeah, it would be a good fit.
All right, next question. Do dust collectors need a grounding rod?
Depends on the dust. Yes, if you have a potential for combustible dust, then yeah, you want to make sure that it's grounded. And in some cases, you even need to ground the filters, right? You need to make sure that there's a metal connection all the way through the process. So yeah, that all goes into understanding the combustibility of your dust and we really encourage our customers to have a dust hazard analysis done, which is going to tell them the combustible nature of their dust and then what mitigation strategies should be implemented in order to make sure that they keep everything as safe as possible.
So there was another question on that exact same topic. What determines whether a dust is combustible? So get it tested, right?
Get it tested. And the two things that we're looking for is the KST value and the Pmax value. And there are guidelines for once it hits a certain level on those values, whether it becomes combustible or not.
All right, so one more baghouse question for you. Is there a mechanism to auto-clean the internal baffles in a baghouse? Dust gets accumulated in the baffles and starts to cake.
There are a lot of different ways you can do that. So there's air cannons, air lancers. There are kind of Solimar pads that you can put in on those baffles in those areas where it could cake, and kind of just disrupt it. There's even acoustic horns that can be put in to kind of keep that material moving so it doesn't settle up. And then, of course, you'll hear vibrators used the most commonly. We try to avoid those because they can be really hard on the equipment itself. But yeah, there are various different options depending on what the nature of the dust is that can be used for that.
All right, so Neil, we've got a few combustible dust questions, of course. So your next one is, if the dust collector is located indoors, okay, inside, would you recommend protective devices, dampers, chemical suppression, upstream and downstream of the dust collector?
Yes. And again, this the $1 million answer in dust collection is it depends, right? That's always the answer that's given. But if you got it indoors and you've got a combustible situation, at a bare minimum, you need a flameless vent. You need the inlet isolation, return air isolation, the after filter. If you've got a particularly volatile dust or application, then suppression system is definitely good. You may need spark detect and extinguish, some sort of optical system in the ductwork that's going to say, oh, there's a spark coming, and blast water to put out the spark. And yeah, you get a little moisture in your dust, but you don't have a fire. So there are a lot of different things that can be done depending on what it is that you're dealing with.
So Neil, we're at the hour mark. Would you be able to stay on for maybe just a few more questions to get the rest of our questions answered? Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. So here's your next one. Well, I kind of feel like we already answered that one. This one is explosion isolation valve or chemical required downstream of the dust collector. So I kind of feel like we addressed that one, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so the next one is actually related to food and beverage. Kind of shifting here a little bit. Oops, it just moved on me. Okay, so it's asking about experience in food and beverage. Is it similar to pharmaceutical? Most equipment I deal with comes with their own dust collectors, but clients don't always want to spend the money on dust collection system. Maybe we should address this one separately.
Yeah, I can just say generally they're very common as far as the dust collector is concerned, because a lot of times, especially when you're dealing with, drugs or food and beverage, anything that humans are ingesting, you might need a specific type of filter that's compliant for food contact or drug contact. A lot of times they're stainless steel. So yeah, there are a lot of similarities between the two industries.
So this is the same person asking that. So when running a DHA, say when they conduct a DHA, do you design for normal operation or do you design for upset operations, spilled bags, equipment failure, et cetera, or both?
It's a combination of both. And really that comes down to risk. So when you have a DHA done by an outside company, they are looking at normal operating procedures, and then they're trying to identify potential upsets and risks that can happen and put mitigation strategies in place so that if those happen, everybody's safe.
Thank you. Can you identify what are the best points in the system for remote monitoring? Are there specific sensors or specific points that are the most important for remote monitoring?
Again, most important is subjective, so it kind of comes down to what the process owner needs to see. But I would say, differential pressure is like the heartbeat of the dust collection system, right? So that's going to tell you when something's wrong. If you're unable to recover after a cleaning cycle, then you know that, okay, there's something causing the differential pressure to stay high. So that's one that I think is critical. Temperature. Most of these filters are rated for a max filtration efficiency. So if you can see a temperature spike before it occurs, you can save a set of filters, or it can indicate you that maybe there's something going on downstream that is upset, causing this higher temperature spike. I think those are and then the last one I'll just kind of ties in with differential pressure, but monitoring your pulse system health, right? If you know when you have a bad diaphragm valve or your solenoid's not firing, that can help you go make that correction quickly and not have to get into a situation where your filters are completely loaded up with dust because your cleaning system's not working.
That's what I've heard as well, that's probably the most common thing that needs to be addressed, or somebody turned the compressed air line off and nobody realizes it.
Yeah, or forgot to turn it on to begin with. Yeah.
Very true.
I've also heard bin sensors, when your dust bin is full and you're not always checking that. You can put a bin sensor in there and say, okay, it's time to empty out the dust bin.
All right. So this is more of this. Now, Neil, I know you don't work up in Canada, but so we just have a question about a design and consulting services up in Ontario, Canada, and we will reach out to you separately to talk to you about that because we can pretty much help anyone just about anywhere right now.
That's right. Yeah, we've got some good partners in Canada.
All right, so here's your next question. You mentioned the alternative baghouse style, so the Dollomatic. So what recommendations do you have for the dust system feeding the dust collector? Do you prevent, how do you prevent buildup in the ducts causing the collection issues in the first place?
Preventing buildup in the duct, is that the question?
Yeah. How
So
do you prevent buildup in the ducts causing collection issues?
that comes down to your duct velocity, right? Maintaining a duct velocity that doesn't allow that dust to settle out and start to build up. So it's a combination of that Q equals V times A, right? So what is the size of your ductwork and what's the velocity that you need to be at? If that's designed properly, that dust is going to flow through and not settle out. If you have an upset condition, you're not pulling enough air, and suddenly your velocity goes from design at 4,000 feet per minute to now you're at 1,500 feet per minute, then you're going to have a problem with dust settling out, and that's where you could notice those kind of things. Again, that kind of goes in hand with the sensors we just talked about, right? If you know there's a differential pressure problem, or you notice your collector's pulsing nonstop, or you just see dust in places that it doesn't belong, it's kind of an indication that there's something going on that's affecting the system's ability to operate at design.
Well, thank you, Neil. So thanks for staying a few minutes afterwards. So what I'm going to do is I will copy